The longest Muslim dynasty was that of the Ottomans. They ruled for 700 years. They came to power with military might, but along with the soldiers came a deep appreciation of the arts and culture. The legacy reached its zenith in Istanbul, where the East and West meet.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
For Muslims like me, Islam is more than a religion. It is a whole way of life. Yes, it is concerned with state and government, but Islam also helps the individual find personal salvation and spiritual peace. That way, he or she can more easily tackle the business of everyday life. While some find salvation through ritual and prayer, others look for different paths. They may express their devotion to God through buildings, paintings, and even music and dance. For the Sufi mystics, the followers of a particularly attractive and open form of Islam, there's special concentration on direct communication with God. And Sufism has particular associations today with Istanbul. The guiding light of Sufism is a medieval poet, Rumi, and his work is flourishing today. Rumi, the 13th century mystic, is the best-selling poet of the United States. His message of universal compassion and acceptance are popular everywhere. He said, "I go to the synagogue, the church and the mosque, and I see the same altar and the same spirit. And here in this former monastery, his devotees of the Mevlevi order still remember him with passion." I feel the revival of interest in Rumi is not only restricted to the West. There's a widespread revival of Sufism in Istanbul and indeed in many other parts of the Muslim world. The Sufis formed themselves into brotherhoods and developed their own mystical ways of knowing God. They became known as dervishes, or seekers of God. Sufis see the unity of God, or tawheed, in everything and everyone. The whirling dervish dance, the sema, is a way of releasing a divine love. The Sufi order of the Mevlevis was founded by Rumi's son and his associates. Their successors still practice the sema today. The spiritual master is seen almost as an embodiment of the patron saint. In their whirling, they attempt to achieve a oneness with God. Orthodox Muslims, of course, frown upon such expressions of piety and reject them as deviants from Islam. The Orthodox belief is that such activity diverts from the worship of God. In Rumi's day, Constantinople, as it was then called, was a Byzantine enclave almost surrounded by Islamic peoples who had moved in from the east. The most vigorous of the invaders were the Seljuks.
The first wave was those of Seljuk Turks, and they established their first state in Iran, today's Iran. And then they invaded Anatolia. In fact, the Islamic Arab conquest paved the way for them, and they introduced a totally new religious, social, and economical system.
Seljuk art survives today all over Turkey. These 13th century carpets would have been much prized and widely traded in their day. They were found in a Seljuk mosque in Konya, the town where Rumi is buried. They had lain for centuries, neglected and rotting. It's thought that they were woven specially for the mosque as a gift from the then reigning sultan. The Seljuks weren't the only Turkish rulers to leave some artistic heritage. These massive doors from a mosque in southeastern Turkey show that skill and craftsmanship had been evident for centuries. The inscription names a ruler from the Zengid dynasty, also in the early 13th century. The Zengids enjoyed a brief independent rule in parts of Iraq and northern Syria. The combination of dragons and lions can often be found in art from that period. Such combinations of powerful animals conveyed an aura of protection over entrances and gateways, keeping out evil spirits. The man who, in 1453, took Constantinople for Islam was Mehmed II, known from then on as Mehmed the Conqueror. His armies breached the city walls and took Constantinople after a 7-week siege. Muslims had been trying to do this since the 7th century. Mehmed saw himself not just as a Muslim emperor, but as the next in a long line of Roman rulers. He rebuilt the city walls and castle. The so-called Golden Gate, now in ruins, is the only Roman relic left today.
Mehmed II and his successors considered themselves as heirs to the Byzantine or Roman Empire. They had their own title of Sultan Rum, that means the ruler of the Roman world or the Sultan of the Rome.
The new Sultan of Rome had his own capital to build. At the heart of his new conquest was Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Its fame throughout the known world made it a huge trophy for Mehmed.
When he entered the building, of course, he was very much impressed by the space because of its very, very large dome covering a very large basilica. And he immediately wanted to be converted into a mosque. And he even prayed in the mosque 3 days after he conquered the city.
The first and most fundamental changes were the addition of a pulpit called a mimbar and a mihrab, the Muslim prayer niche, the two physical essentials for its conversion to a mosque. But his most critical decision was what to do about the rich Christian mosaics which adorned the Byzantine cathedral. Muslims considered the depiction of people in any religious context as a sort of idol worship, even if they were depictions of Christ and the Virgin Mary, both of whom have a high status in Islam.
In the Islamic world, we don't have monumental paintings in mosques. Although there is no prohibition in the Quran for painting, the worship of idols is not permitted because, this is one principle of Islam faith, which has no similarity with Christian belief, because God transcends all images. That's why in the Islamic world, monumental painting was prohibited.
When Mehmed the Conqueror converted this great cathedral into a mosque, he made sure that the images of Jesus and Mary, who Muslims revere, were treated with great respect. Today, Hagia Sophia is a museum. People of all faiths who visit it should be grateful to Mehmed for his solution to the problem of the images. Instead of destroying them, he plastered over the mosaics, so preserving them through the centuries. In the 15th century, the world was turning upside down. In 1453, when Mehmed the Conqueror captured Constantinople, he renamed it Istanbul, the city of Islam, and converted the great cathedral into a mosque. Islam seemed unstoppable. Yet, only a few decades later, Muslims would lose Granada, their last stronghold in Spain, and Christopher Columbus would sail for America. The loss of Spain and the expulsion from the beautiful lands of Andalusia has left a permanent scar on Muslims. Today, the Alhambra in Granada gives just a glimpse of how much Islamic rulers and their artists had accomplished there, and so just how deep that loss was. Poetry and novels still lament that legendary paradise. Much Islamic architecture, certainly most of what survives today, was built under state patronage. Even the richest courtier usually needed the permission of the Sultan or the authorities before he could build. The rulers of Granada itself were the Nasirids. The courtyards and beautiful tilework of the Alhambra Palace disguised the fact that these Muslim rulers were generally mediocre and rather decadent. Mathematics and astronomy flourished, but so did murder and intrigue. They were easy game for their Catholic conquerors. But as Muslim rule collapsed in the West, it was reinvigorated in the East. When the Muslims were finally expelled, many of them found their way to Constantinople or Istanbul, where re-energized Islam was making its mark. Constantinople was a dying and decaying city. The new Muslim rulers brought in people from different cultures and religions, including Jews and Christians, and repopulated it. And Istanbul became the thriving and bustling city it is today. The bazaar is the embodiment of the hustle and the prosperity of today's Istanbul. But its origins go directly back to that period of reinvigoration when the Ottomans arrived. Mehmet himself founded the bazaar.
He ordered people from several regions of the empire to come and settle in Istanbul. This was an obligation. People from all over the empire were forcibly settled in Istanbul. But they were not selected randomly. They were usually masters in a certain art, in a certain branch of trade, or in architecture or in art.
Later, it was one of these young craftsmen who became the greatest Ottoman architect. His name was Sinan. He established a distinctively Ottoman style that was to become familiar to everyone. And his inspiration was the Hagia Sophia, originally Christian.
Sinan was inspired by the dome because the dome has been a problem for architects for centuries. But you see, the Ottoman dome is a dome in stone. This is very important because in the earlier centuries, there are brick domes. Brick is much easier to build up.
The dome and pencil-thin minarets were to become the trademark of Sinan. He had been born a Christian and built with the zeal of a convert. In Istanbul, there was the Suleymaniye Mosque complex, Kilij Ali Pasha Mosque, and the Rustam Pasha Mosque. The evidence of Sinan's skills can be found not just in Istanbul, but all over the Ottoman Empire, from the Balkans to Baghdad. He designed 355 building projects, including 81 mosques. Aleppo in Syria has at least 2 mosques attributed to the master. The Khosrofia, named after an Ottoman governor of the province, was the first Ottoman-style mosque to be built in the city. In Damascus, Sinan designed another religious complex known as the Taqiyya. This was intended as a hostel, providing free lodgings and a place to pray for the pilgrims on their way to Mecca.
Rather like the carnival in Rio, the pilgrimage in Damascus was the sort of thing around which the whole year revolved.
Throughout the Ottoman times, the pilgrimage was a huge event, and the prestige of the Ottoman Sultan depended greatly on the success of the pilgrimage, the Hajj. The long processions with thousands of pilgrims, not to mention a small army of merchants, soldiers, and other hangers-on, was seen off from Damascus in grand style. It was an emotional business. Many were not going to come back.
The pilgrimage from Damascus to Mecca was incredibly dangerous because you have to see Damascus as a kind of port, the last civilized place, before you got to this vast ocean of sand, which was the desert. And the desert was full of Bedouin tribes who knew damn well that these pilgrims, on the way back especially, were loaded with stuff they'd bought in Mecca. Sometimes the Bedouins poisoned the wells, filling them with dead animals. Sometimes they just attacked them and slaughtered them. There were instances when the whole pilgrimage, and you have to remember this is something like 20,000 people, were just killed by the Bedouin. And if the pilgrimage came back successfully, then the whole Ottoman world rejoiced, because it meant money in the coffers.
In the Ottoman capital, Istanbul, it was that money in the coffers that enabled the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent to build what is widely regarded to be one of the finest examples of Ottoman architecture, the Suleymaniye. If much Ottoman architecture was state-sponsored architecture, Sinan was its supreme practitioner. It was here that Sinan perfected his use of domes.
Sinan used these half domes and quarter domes and galleries to support. So when you look at a typical Ottoman mosque, you see it goes up step by step. All these elements go step by step to the dome.
The weight of the main dome forces its supporting walls outwards. By using half and quarter domes, the force is converted into a downward one, which the walls can support. The smaller domes disguise the buttressing which supports the main dome externally. And the thin buttresses allow the dome to be surrounded by windows. Inside, the main dome is supported by 4 slim pillars. The 4 red granite pillars are said to have come from each of the 4 corners of the empire.
He looked at the Hagia Sophia. When it was first built, it had enormous numbers of windows. But of course, as they built more and more buttresses to keep the thing up, they blocked the windows. What Sinan was able to do, probably because he understood that, was to build a series of mosques where the interior during the day was flooded with light. And at night, you had these huge hoops with oil lamps on them, that also provided this great sheet of light beyond which the dome loomed and seemed almost to be part of the sky because it wasn't visibly linked to the building beneath.
Suleiman the Magnificent's body is buried under another of Sinan's domes, in a tomb beside the mosque. The pepper pot tomb reflects the cascading shape of the main building. Adjacent to it is the tomb of Suleiman's scheming wife, Roxelana. She had persuaded Suleiman to have his eldest son killed so her own son could inherit the throne. Sinan, the great architect, died in 1588. In contrast to his monumental works, he is buried in a modest tomb in the shadow of the Suleymaniye. Sinan's tomb is just a small part of what makes up the largest religious and social complex ever built under the Ottomans. Surrounding the prayer hall and courtyard is a small town of other buildings which go to make up the Suleymaniye. Sinan built for a ruling religion. His mosques had to be bigger and his minarets higher than any Christian church.
The mosque is surrounded by a number of colleges, a hospital, a public kitchen, a caravanserai, a bathhouse, and these have been placed on the hilly terrain of the historic peninsula in such a way that the dome of the mosque dominates the whole complex, and the whole in turn dominates the hill that overlooks the Golden Horn, is what makes Suleymaniye such an accomplishment.
Further along the peninsula, his seat of government also overlooked the waterway. The hub of empire had been here since the Ottomans arrived. It was the sparkling jewel of Turkish architecture, the Topkapi Palace. Istanbul was the capital of the bustling, powerful and rich Ottoman Empire. From it, power radiated like the spokes of a wheel. And at its hub was the Topkapi Palace, which for 400 years was the home of the royal court and the political center of the empire. It is essentially a series of 4 courts, each being more exclusive than the preceding one. The first court is guarded by the Bab-e-Humayun, upon which the heads of traitors were displayed as a warning to others. The first court was functional, flanked by a hospital, bakery, mint, armory, and accommodation for palace servants. But at its end stands the Gate of Greeting. Through it is the second court and the council chamber. Here the Sultan and his ministers would meet to conduct their business.
In the 16th century, it became the practice for the Sultan not to attend the imperial council, but he had to be seen to keep an eye on it. So there's a grill in the wall, high up on the wall behind the council benches, and that was covered with a window. So if the Sultan wanted to, he could go there and watch the council at work. But if he didn't fancy it, then they couldn't tell he wasn't there.
Later, in an adjoining and more lavishly decorated room, the Sultan would question his ministers on what business had been discussed. Not knowing if they'd been overheard or not, the ministers were obliged to tell the truth. The Bab-e-Sadat, or the Gate of Felicity, leads to the third and more private court. The Sultan alone was allowed to ride through this gate on horseback. Those few mere mortals whom the eunuch guards allowed to pass had to do so on foot. But enough feet have trodden this path over the centuries to leave a distinct impression in the marble floor. Many of those feet were making their way to the Chamber of Petitions. Here, the Sultan would receive ambassadors.
If you were an ambassador, you were taken through really under pretty large guard, and you were presented to the Sultan, who sat in this chamber, which is a sort of pavilion standing on its own, very, very grand, surrounded by an arcade. And the Sultan would sit on his throne in the corner in total silence and fail to notice you. And the French ambassador or the Dutch ambassador or whoever, or the Iranian ambassador, would be brought in and would be shown the Sultan, and he would present things to the Sultan, but the Sultan generally didn't deign to notice that anyone had come to see him.
The Topkapi Palace wasn't just a seat of power, it was a seat of learning too. One of its many functions was as a sort of university for the next generation of Ottoman governors. Promising students were recruited from across the empire, turning the bustling palace into an international melting pot. But a quirk of fate was to change the ordered administrative function of the Topkapi Palace.
In the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, there was a fire in the old palace, which was the first palace of the sultans in Istanbul, and that's where the women lived. And so Suleiman's wife, Hürrem Sultan, actually decided she'd go and live with him in the palace. And so to the left of this courtyard is where a harem buildings were inserted into the ground plan, although there wasn't really room for them.
The harem's very existence might escape the casual visitor, were its presence not given away by the looming Tower of Justice at its center. This was a sort of lookout post from which the Sultan could observe his palace and city without the bother of having to leave the harem. The harem was originally built by Sinan in the late 16th century. It became the principal quarters of the royal family, sultans, mothers, wives, concubines, everyone. The guards were eunuchs. Sinan had become chief architect in 1538. He was responsible for the ceramics workshops as well as building, and under his influence there was a transformation in the way tile work was used. It became an integral feature of Ottoman architecture. Shapes and sizes were standardized and a sort of mass production started. Tiles covered the walls like tapestries and textiles. No section of the royal quarters proclaimed the Sultan's wealth and liking for luxury better than the 16th century bath complex. Marble and gold abound. Part of the harem acted as a prison for the Sultan's younger brothers, albeit a luxurious prison. In early Turkish and Mongol tradition, a dead leader's lands and wealth were divided up among his sons. Dividing an empire would only leave weak individual parts. So the radical solution of killing the younger sons was employed.
This was a practical solution, but this was applied only for 2 centuries, and then it turned into a more continental style. The other male members were not killed, but they were kept in what we called kafes or cage in the palace until they die.
The young princes were locked up here in luxury with guards and concubines of their own. They just stayed there for years, and many were found to be quite mad by the time they were let out, if ever they were. Turkish annals are full of stories about paranoid princes sanctioning mass murder if they ever became sultan themselves. In the 17th century, one such prince was Ibrahim the Mad. He was released from the cage after 22 years and seated on the throne. He is said to have been a regular bather and reveler in the pool at the center of the fourth court. On his emergence from the cage, he promptly drowned 280 of his concubines after rumors of harem plotting. Next to the pool, Ibrahim the Mad built a small but exquisite feature, a golden loggia, from where he could gaze down on the center of his empire.
One of the most monumental parts of the palace complex, a loggia that overlooks the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, offering views of whatever was sort of beneath the eyes of the Sultan, whatever was visible in the geography that he controlled, in the geography that the Ottoman Empire controlled.
But Ibrahim had a much more practical use for the loggia during the fasting month of Ramadan.
During the month of Ramadan, you're not allowed to eat as a Muslim in the hours of daylight. The idea is the Sultan sat on there, and because he had a good view of where the sun set, he could start his meal as soon as the sun had set in the west. And this little balcony gives a fantastic view over the Golden Horn.
Ibrahim also built the circumcision room, covered inside and out with 16th and 17th century Iznik tiles. This was the heyday of tile making in Iznik, a town about 60 kilometers southeast of Istanbul. The early Iznik tiles were mainly blue and white, although a few other colors, such as red, were added to the palette later on. Just before that, more Iznik tiles were employed in the fourth court when the Baghdad Pavilion was built to celebrate the Ottomans taking of that city in 1638. Other Istanbul buildings are also famed for the quality of their tiles. One is another of Sinan's masterpieces, the small Rustam Pasha Mosque. It was commissioned in 1561 to commemorate an Ottoman general who had been born in Bosnia and eventually married Suleiman's daughter. He became Grand Vizier and accumulated huge wealth. This wealth is evident in the lavish interior of the mosque with its wonderful tile work.
What makes A highly favored work of Ottoman architecture is the quality of its tiles. The later 16th century marked the zenith of Ottoman tile industries. And Rüstem Pasha is a museum, in a way, of that tile art.
The other Istanbul mosque famed for its tiles is the Sultan Ahmed or Blue Mosque.
The tiles there are a little bit later, so they weren't necessarily of the same enormously high quality they had been during the latter part of Rüstem Pasha's life. So the tile panels are not as perhaps inventive and not as high quality in their execution, but they certainly are decent enough for anyone else, I think.
The Blue Mosque, though, comes in for a fair bit of criticism. One aspect frowned upon by the scholars is the size of the dome's supporting pillars.
The problem with the Blue Mosque is that Sinan's successor in the post of chief architect, Sedef Kar Mehmedar, he understood how to build the building, but he didn't have the same finesse. And so when you go into the Blue Mosque, as opposed to the Süleymaniye or the Selimiye, then you do notice that there are these 4 huge piers that support the domes, and they're generally known as elephant's feet.
Another criticism leveled at the Blue Mosque concerns the minarets. They may be elegant, but there are 6 of them. There's no other mosque outside Mecca that boasts 6 minarets. Many see this as a sacrilegious challenge to the holy city. But whether it's intentionally sacrilegious or not, and whether it's clumsy and heavy inside, from the outside, it is still a magnificent statement of Ottoman power.
Within the overall framework of Ottoman architecture, I mean, it's not the greatest because it wasn't designed by a genius, but it certainly holds its own for most people, and it's like a huge and rather beautiful mountain with these architectural foothills.
The Sultan Ahmed's mosque's popular name of the Blue Mosque was given to it by Western visitors. The reason isn't difficult to guess. The color of the interior tiles were blue. Sitting astride the waterway that separates Europe from Asia, Istanbul has always been influenced by a mixture of cultures. As trade increased over the centuries, so foreign influences became stronger in Ottoman architecture. Chinese influences can be seen in the public fountain of Sultan Ahmed III. It was built in 1729 and reminds me of a pagoda. This was called the Tulip period because the Sultan loved tulips. The golden Arabic calligraphy includes verses from Islamic poets. A similar style is evident on the 6-sided ablutions fountain built outside the Hagia Sophia in the days when it was a mosque. The fountain was built 10 years later than that of Sultan Ahmed III, and it was in a style called Turkish Rococo. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European style started to be seen all over the Ottoman Empire in domestic houses. Yet the eclectic mix of influences didn't affect the seasonal lifestyle. Effectively, there are 2 houses stacked one upon the other. For the summer, the ground floor is a typical Islamic courtyard house with its cooling fountain and pool. In the winter, the occupants would follow the practice of centuries, retreating upstairs to warmer quarters. In this house in Aleppo, the European influence is even more evident. But as European influence started to seep through, sometimes swamping, Islamic art forms, one particular skill has survived since the earliest times: calligraphy, or beautiful writing.
In Islamic belief, the central role is played by the revelation of the Word of God, which is the Quran. And so from the beginning of the Islamic era in the 7th century, the recording of that became very important. By the 8th century, it's clear that a special way of writing Arabic had been developed that was subject to rules which were designed to make it beautiful as well as legible, and they're the rules that are behind Arabic calligraphy.
Beautifully illustrated Qurans are among the most prized objects in the Muslim world. Ancient decorated Qurans have been known to change hands for huge sums. The art is still practiced enthusiastically today. This Sufi master calligrapher has many students who are eager to learn the finer points from him. They are trained for many years in the strict rules governing the different Arabic scripts in which the Quran is written. The training is often as much spiritual as practical. Copying and decorating Qurans was seen as a form of religious devotion. It became an honorable occupation, fit for a prince.
Towards the end of the 17th century, it's the first time that the princes are actually taught to be calligraphers from the time when they're children. So many of the sultans who came to the throne in the 18th and 19th century were actually trained calligraphers, and a lot of emphasis was given on that. As a sign of being a gentleman, it's a sign of the civil bureaucracy being in charge, rather than the earlier periods when it was really the sultan's ability to fight battles that was more important.
The sultans had official seals called togras. These were calligraphic devices used to authenticate official documents. In Istanbul today, modern Islamic artists are also using calligraphic devices in their art, but with a figurative twist. Gallery owner Haldun Dostlu showed me some of their work. The Turkish artist Murat Morava has introduced Sufi themes into a context which has homoerotic overtones. In this work, he has combined the Arabic characters for the three great Shia religious figures in a search for the perfect man.
And what he used here, as you know, this is a very traditional anonymous illustration of a human being, which is made of Arabic calligraphies. It says Ali Hassan Hussein, so the perfect human being is made of Ali Hassan Hussein.
Is he controversial?
Kind of. He's trying to put his sexual choice in his art, which makes his art very crucial and sensitive.
As we have seen, some of the more controversial aspects of Sufism are alien to Orthodox Muslims. But I am inspired by the legacy of the great mystics, though their Islam may be far from the great official mosques and madrasas. The mystics, with their universal message appealing to all, provide the only platform that will allow our different religions, nations, sects and tribes to be able to come together in peace and harmony. The message of the mystics runs through all the great faiths back to earliest time and is so strong in Islam. Theirs is a beautiful message of love, hope and optimism, and one that ultimately underlines our common humanity.